Yeah, mostly, but except for, I would like, well, I'm gonna do Stucky now, Jay, like two. I mean.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this working?
Testing.
Yes, yes it is. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final panel session of today's proceedings on new directions in the history of emancipation and reconstruction, which is, I hope, a title that will apply to this whole conference in the long run, that we will find new directions to take. My name is Christopher Clark. I'm a member of the History Department here at the University of Connecticut. It's a great privilege to be asked to take part in this session. This is a wonderful conference, and we are very honored to have so many fine scholars here joining us. We have 4 speakers on this session. Abigail Cooper is Assistant Professor of History at Brandeis University, working on a project called Conjuring Emancipation, which works on the connections between Black spiritual creativity, kinship formation, and political participation after the Civil War. And she has a paper title that I think is just wonderful. It's up there for you. James Downs is Professor of History and Director of the American Studies Program at Connecticut College. He's the author of, among other things, a book called Sick from Freedom, African American Illness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction. And he's currently working on a project called The Laboring Dead, From Subjugation to Science, that explores the connections between colonialism, slavery, and war, and the development of epidemiology. And we're going to be hearing some of that this afternoon. Carol Emberton is Associate Professor of History at the University of Buffalo. Her first book, Beyond Redemption, Race, Violence, and the American South After the Civil War, won the Southern Association of Women Historians Willie Lee Rose Prize for Best Book in Southern History. And she's now working on a project on the experiences of war and emancipation as spoken about by the men and women who were interviewed by the Federal Writers Project. And Amy Murrell Taylor is Associate Professor of History at the University of Kentucky. She's the author of Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War's Slave Refugee Camps, which was published by UNC Press last year, and other work. And she will be talking about that work and the experience of emancipation for refugees in her paper today. So welcome to all our speakers, and we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Thank you very much, Manisha, for inviting me, and I am honored to be on this panel, and I can't wait to talk with all of you and with all of you. Today I'm going to outline 3 definitions of conjure, what I mean by conjure when I say that conjuring emancipation is my central argument. I'm going to flesh those out, and then we're going to look at an archaeological dig of a refugee camp, Camp Nelson in Kentucky. Jim Downs and Amy Murrell Taylor both talk about Camp Nelson in their books. And then I'm going to talk about pierced dimes, buttons, and Congo cosmograms. And of course, midwives are going to be in this throughout. They become centerpieces of the reconstruction process, especially in refugee camps, which are majority women and children. And then I'm going to look at a Zora Neale Hurston interview with Shady Ann Sutton, who indicts those who get learning to eradicate basically the folk practices from the history of what got us through. And I want to kind of take that up as an appeal to look again at what seem like familiar sources and see how we can read them with alternative eyes. So, conjuring emancipation, what cosmogram buttons, placenta fires mean for secular-speaking Reconstruction historians. Enslaved people did more than pray for emancipation. They conjured it. And I have 3 definitions for this. The first is the sacred meaning of conjure, to conjure as in to affect by an appeal to supernatural power. So that means to tie dimes around your children's ankles so they have safe passage. It means to gather for watch night meetings, to directly influence a result, to influence emancipation's coming the next day. To scratch Congo cosmograms on these buttons, and to turn Bible readings not into just inert educational experiences, but as divinations. To carry pieces of roots or rope as talismans of freedom. To turn midnight funeral services into awakenings. And to light the mother's placenta on fire ritualistically so that it can do her no harm after she's given birth. You have to ritualistically burn the placenta because one, animals could eat it, and if that were to happen, it could have ramifications for the shared experience of the mother and the child. It was a piece of them. And there's also a black market value of placentas, so for medicinal purposes. So if it fell into the wrong hands, it could also cause the mother to suffer. The second meaning I have is the secular meaning, to conjure, as in to bring about something that wasn't there before. And this is, to conjure emancipation means to build huts, to heal sickness. It means to feed families, to join armies, to get to the daughter, son, wife, mother, sister, brother, husband sold away in slavery. And third is a meaning something in between secular and sacred. It's an old Latin definition that we don't use anymore, but it's relevant here. Con is with, together. Jurare is an oath, to swear an oath. So conjure, to swear an oath together. And that has resonances for Reconstruction, because how do you ensure trust between people you don't know? How do you create imagined communities that existed on a completely different paradigm before? Now, historians, of course, have long studied Black resistance and religion, but I'm looking for it elsewhere. I'm looking for it in superstitions, what the records call superstitions. Yet, Black folk practices don't map easily onto dominant frameworks for narrating the history of Reconstruction. African Americans, even so, though, formed bonds and developed cooperation in a way that was both a continuation of the resistance they had known in slavery, but also something wholly new because of the way that emancipation itself was woven into that sacred narrative. Now, I'm often revisiting and trying to revive the work of Sterling Stuckey, as Kendra Field mentioned earlier. I'm taking from Leon Litwack and Lawrence Levine. I'm bringing in Robert Ferris Thompson, and I'm looking then to some of the new work in Africana studies and Black studies. My argument then integrates new archaeologies and anthropologies of culture that give insight into how African Americans used these rituals and symbols that were foreign to the missionaries and to the military agents in the camps and the Freedmen's Bureau that had to be erased or downplayed. But nevertheless, they used those to form unions between each other, to form solidarities, and even to enact social controls in these liminal spaces of circumscribed autonomy. I've also centered midwives, which is something you don't find in the 70s and 80s literature. I find them to be kind of jack-in-the-box cropping up in the superintendent's reports because there's a health crisis, as we know. But who's there to deliver babies? The Yankees don't have a whole lot of reckoning with the gynecological needs of warfare. And so what knowledge base is there? And midwives impart intimate knowledge of women's bodies, not only as sites of subjection, but also as sites of vitality. And she knew things. She knew how to mark time by taking a dry fern and putting it in water, and it would slowly unfurl, marking the contractions. She knew how to control breathing by blowing in a bottle. She knew which flies spread yellow fever. This centering then brings not only Black female leadership to the fore, but also spiritual practice as the locus of power and the location for making meaning in freedom's birth. And it's fitting that it's refugee camps that I look to for a lot of these records, because it's this unstable place, this place of liminality that brings a specific brand of power and influence, because they were in spaces that no one wanted control of, because there was often times where when no one knew what to do with them, people erected shanty towns or huts and villages on the spot. They called them Dinktown. They said they were digging underground. Refugees did not own property, but they occupied space. They had no rights the state recognized, yet they carved out autonomies. So in this first definition, the appeal to the supernatural, I'm looking at African traditional religions which have ancestral reverence becomes a key point. Divination practices, water immersion, which is, you can see how Afro-Baptist faiths, the Baptists are those who have more converts than Methodists or any other denomination. That's because of the analog of water immersion rites that are very familiar in Africa. The counterclockwise circle, which I'll come back to with the cosmogram, and the connectedness of the harm-heal nexus, which actually goes counter to a lot of liberal paradigms of do no harm, everything will be okay. Conjure culture reinforced public standards of group behavior, and it connected people to communities operating under hegemonic understandings outside of the white planter class and outside of the Yankees who were trying to teach them. And the brilliance of it, even as it had conflict, lied in its collectively held understandings of the power to harm and heal who were outside of white control or understanding. Conjure culture became pivotal in emancipation, even as it forged with elements of Christianity to imbue power and creativity. To bring about something that was not there before, the second meaning is a social history. And it's meant to build on the work of Kate Mazer and Jim Downs and Amy Murrell Terrell and Chandra Manning. But it's taking a different tack by showing how conjure culture also infused a lot of the building of huts. What do you have to do to bless a home? What do you have to do to heal that is not wholly secular? And the third meaning, to band together to take an oath. You know, Reconstruction history, it's all about oaths. It's all about solidifying loyalty to something, to trying to figure out trust between people, and what does that? And we have our own rituals. The right hand on the Bible, the hand in a perpendicular salute, that is a very familiar ritual that somehow magically transforms what I say into truth, into something that can be trusted, that connects people and binds it in a legal sense, in a ceremonial sense. So what then are there for the refugees? And that's where I want to talk about, let's see, this dig. Is it going forward? Was it correct? I got it, right? Okay, one more time. Oh, there we go. Guess only. So this is from an archaeological dig in Camp Nelson. It was done in 2010. And I want to talk about what this is here. This is the pierced dimes. These are the buttons, and these are the Congo cosmograms that are etched on the round buttons. You can, yeah, they're in the back too. So what's significant about this is that this is in Kentucky, so this isn't South Carolina Sea Islands or Georgia Sea Islands where African continuities are very similar to what they are in the Black Atlantic. This is far inland, and it's important because this was found Camp Nelson is a Union camp, but they are in huts that are basically squatters. They're outside of the barracks, outside of the formal soldiers and soldiers' wives, and instead are the informal people just who haven't been expelled yet. There's a big expulsion that happens around Thanksgiving of 1864, and that's how they know, and they date it to 1864, because you can see the burn damage up here. So dimes, these pierced dimes as protective charms. Every one of my children wears a silver dime on a string around their leg to keep off the witch's spell, Gertrude Vogler said. William Willis explained that people wore a silver coin in their shoes and made some holes in the coin. They threaded a string through it, and they attached it to the ankle so no one could conjure them. Then George Womble said, to keep from being conjured, you tie the string around, but you can't let it turn dark, because then someone is trying to do you harm. Others wore dimes for health, for rheumatism. A dime was put around the baby's neck for teething. Pierced coins were everyday objects imbued with attributes of divine power. Another archaeological dig in Dallas, there was a highway, and they found a freedmen's cemetery from 1869, and there they found 15 bodies that had these pierced dimes, and 10 out of the 15 were children under the age of 2. In this case, this wasn't like Gertrude Vogler tying stringed pierced dimes around her children to protect their journey, but instead it was to protect their journey into the afterlife. The circle of the coin signified the continuity of life. Circles become extremely important. And the piercing of it is, of course, to turn it into a necklace, but also in cowrie shells, piercing a dime actually increased its value because it replicated the human eye. So the idea of a charm related to currencies of human civilizations resonates in the context of a new freedom, but as an alternative currency, not as a pre-currency. So historians of capitalism, please integrate that somehow. Now, buttons. The buttons why this is significant that they found buttons, you would think because there's so many seamstresses, it's of course, there's buttons, but that's not the case. There's no sewing needles, there's not any other sign that there was sewing going on here. These buttons are charms. Rena Clark's baby began teething, and she always tied 6 buttons around her baby's neck, along with a mole's foot. Then the child will feel no pain and not know it's teething. Midwife Mamie Hanbury called snake's eyes buttons. And Sina Banks said, people wear strings of buttons that give them and that other people give them, and they call it a charm string. So there's an exchange in it. There's a person that's also associated with that button. And I think maybe perhaps the symbolism of the sound and the flash of also the Union soldiers' buttons. Anyone who's read the records knows how those brass buttons are so important. Frederick Douglass famously says, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US and let him get an eagle on his button, there's no power on earth which can deny he has earned the right of citizenship. So that button as a symbol of a connection to the American state. There's also Eugene Wesley Smith, a soldier who says, Negro troops came in singing, don't you see the lightning? Don't you hear the thunder? It isn't the lightning, it isn't the thunder, it is the buttons on the Negroes' uniforms. So you hear that revolutionary valence isn't just a matter of now we're Americans, but I suggest that it's the flash of the spirit. The shiny object is a reflection through which ancestors can communicate. The cosmogram is a cross, but it's not exactly a crucifix. And so the different signs of the cosmogram signify different phases of the day, of the sun, and then of life. And it shows that at midnight, which is when refugees have their funerals, that is when it's noon for the ancestors. And so there's not just a kind of outside of the white gaze, but also a connecting power with the ancestors. This idea of the cosmogram should change the way we think we are reading Christianity, and it should also get us to rethink health, because the cosmogram is a marker for health in colonel-ware bowls. So it marks the difference between a medicine bowl and just a bowl where you eat, which is very important. And it's also for marking homes. Ma Stevens is a root doctor, and she said the powder should be sprinkled in the four corners of a room, going diagonally from one corner to the other, making a cross to bless it. So collective nocturnal rituals were the ways that refugees ordered their experiences of grief. And these buttons and these dimes become mortuary symbols as well. And then we can see and reinterpret that the experience of death in refugee camps was not just the tragedy that it was, but it's also an opportunity for creativity and communality. And so I want to turn to what I get from Shady Ann Sutton. And also I want to kind of implore Reconstruction historians, as you come into the archives, to think a little bit about how different people are ensuring trust and how we can reread some of these sources. One way to also sanction trust is to put your hand on the cosmogram and swear. And if you're swearing an oath, even if you swear it in like the way of the cosmogram, it's almost like crossing yourself. You swear that you understand the difference between life and death. The revolutionary force of the Civil War bears some culpability in obscuring the ritual objects of import for Black emancipation, because the mandate that anchored the Reconstruction Amendments as a chance for Black belonging and equality necessitated the hushing of that which white people would see as irrational. These young people read they books and talk about the war freeing the Negroes, but I, Lord, a heap sees, but a few knows, Shady Ann Sutton told Zora Neale Hurston in 1938. They got ashamed of the things that brought us through. The Civil War, the war that slavery made, the war that made emancipation, was also the war that Shady Ann Sutton said was just a sign and a symbol of the thing. The story behind the thing did not make it to the ears of white folks. You can't know what folks won't tell you. Sometimes they picked up some scraps, but they had no way to understand it because they had nothing to hear things with that with. Now, I ask us how Shady Ann Sutton's appeal can lead Civil War and Reconstruction historians to recognize alternative intelligences and alternative ways of reading familiar records, and perhaps that those pieces that are usually discarded because of the fears of essentializing Blackness come into view as possibilities for reconstructing hegemonies. Thank you.
So first, I just want to thank Manisha and Juliet for organizing the conference, and also for whomever is doing this sort of live stream broadcast. It took me 5 hours to get here, but fortunately, I watched it vis-a-vis my Bluetooth in my car, so I saw the entire conference this morning, so thank you. I don't even see where you are. It's kind of scary, but thank you for doing it. I know you're there, so thank you. In my first book, Sick from Freedom, I argued that over 60,000 freed slaves died from a smallpox epidemic. My current project is less concerned with health conditions and instead uses the understandings of illness to think about how doctors and scientists develop new ideas about epidemiology. In order to do a study of epidemiology, I'm not just focusing on the United States, but I'm placing the study within a broader global context where I'm placing the post-war period in conversation with the Crimean War, imperialism in India, slavery in Africa, and slavery and colonialism in the Caribbean. I'm going to begin today by taking my cue from Saidiya Hartman's eloquent formulation of critical fabulation to sort of set the stage for the study. I'm then going to move into the archival evidence, and then I'm going to finish with a few questions about what we can think about in terms of the panel about new directions in the study of emancipation. Maybe the child was crying, his mother holding his hand as the overseer tried to carry him away, pulling him from his home that resembled a hut to a clearing far from where the cotton grew, to under a tree where two white men stood, an owner who may have not known the child's name but could easily size him up and assign a price, and a doctor who may have fidgeted, who maybe wasn't sure if his idea would work. Or maybe there was no doubt of resistance. The Civil War had already broken out and an unexpected enemy emerged, disease. So maybe the child's mother did not scream because she thought this could protect them against the invisible enemies that threaten their bodies. In this scenario, she confidently and possibly even proudly escorted her child to the two men who stood under the shadow that the tall hickory tree cast, where cotton whirled like snow flurries, far from where it grew, but sticking to her hair, her dress, her child's hand. And the overseer trailed behind her because he told her that this was going to save her child, that she was lucky to have been selected. Others had gone before them, but not everyone got the chance to meet the doctor and the owner. The doctor had no apprehension, but was fully confident in his choices because he read an article in a medical journal that this was the surest way to prevent smallpox from spreading. And so the owner didn't fidget or even worry because he too knew that in order to do this, he was not only protecting the value of this young boy, but of all enslaved people on his plantation, as well as his family and those who lived nearby. The doctor then reached into his medicine bag and lifted out a kit that included a tin box that contained smallpox scabs, which had scraped off patients who had been infected with the virus. The tin box also included lymph, which was the colorless fluid that oozed from under a smallpox vesicle that was used as vaccine matter. And inside the doctor's kit was a lancet, a surgical knife that the doctor used to cut the vesicle from the infected patient. The doctor then approached the healthy child and his mother with the lancet in his hand. The mother may have at first flinched at the sight of the sharp knife approaching her and her child. The child may have cried, and the mother may have begged the doctor not to perform this procedure. But during slavery, enslaved people's cries were ignored. The doctor eventually grabbed the child. The overseer and the owner may have pinned the child against the tree and pushed the mother to the ground. The doctor needed to get hold of the child's arm and eventually used the lancet to cut open the flesh. The doctor then carefully removed the lymph from the kit. Using a quill, he removed the vaccine and placed it into the bleeding arm of the child. During the Civil War, smallpox, which had been around for centuries, erupted in unprecedented numbers. Long before the war began, doctors and municipal authorities quarantined infected patients to prevent the virus from spreading. While this generally was an effective, if polemical, preventative measure, during the war this was nearly impossible to do as a result of the vast population movement. Consequently, many Southern doctors began to turn to a relatively new method of prevention. Inoculation developed as a method to prevent smallpox from spreading by taking the vesicles and lymph from an infected patient and then injecting it as vaccine matter into a healthy patient so that the person would then develop a milder version of the virus known as modified varroa or vaccinia, and they would hopefully survive it. In general, this process worked. Under the hickory tree, the doctor and the owner and the overseer were not injecting lymph into the crying enslaved child's arm in order to inoculate them from smallpox. They were infecting the child with the virus in order to use the child's body to harvest more vesicles and lymph. The war caused an immediate need for vaccine matter, but doctors failed to get their hands on what little vaccine existed in the country. Southern doctors then turned to enslaved children as the most effective way to harvest vaccinia on their bodies. They had considered using soldiers, but some argued against it because soldiers had endured fatiguing campaigns and hardships. Young, healthy children, they contended, offer the healthiest bodies to harvest vaccine matter. Based on this logic, they even began to use infants. Cradled in their enslaved mother's arm, an infant slept completely unaware that its body, which was too young to walk, too young to talk, too young to join the armies of people who stampeded to the rice fields with tools belted around their waist, had to work. Planters and doctors had conjured a plan that an infant whose life was measured by days and weeks and probably not even months could also be put to work. Half the size of an infant's arm, the lancet piercing into the newborn's paper-thin flesh would have certainly waked the baby or intensified their cries, making sounds that could never be translated into language. After the doctor inserted the lymph into the infant's arm, he would wait. He would come back 2 or 3 days, hoping that the infant had contracted a fever, which would have signaled the infant's body's contracted the virus, that the process had begun to work, that its tiny body had begun to labor. A few days later, as the mother kissed her baby's forehead to feel for its temperature, or swaddled her child into a burlap bag that had been boiled into a gown, she would begin to see small red blisters erupting on her newborn's body. They could be anywhere: the arms, the tummy, the back, the forehead, the eyelids, the back of the neck, the bottom. Human development had set a course to determine the growth of the infant, but slavery and the Civil War had intervened. It had set the infant's body to work according to a new timeline. Slaveholders and later generations of well-intentioned historians who resurrected the field of slavery and capitalism have followed the same logic of debit and credit, loss and gain, business and economy, but they have failed to see how slavery's most vulnerable population were also employed. I discovered traces of this practice of using infants to harvest vaccinia in the Confederate medical archives that emerged in response to the US government's charges of war against Henry Wirtz. After the Civil War, the US government charged Wirtz with war crimes based on his cruel punishment of Union prisoners of war in Andersonville. Among his many charges, which ranged from torture to inhumane punishment, he was also accused of commanding Confederate doctors to purposely poison prisoners with smallpox vaccine. While the harrowing history of Wirtz and Andersonville has been documented, the accusation that Wirtz ordered Confederate doctors to purposely poison Union prisoners of war by giving them smallpox has been overlooked. References to it are buried in the trial transcript that spans over 800 pages and appears only in a handful of witness testimonies. It's also mentioned among the official charges leveled against Wirtz, but again, it's buried among a long list of appalling punishments that range from whipping to starvation. Within this context, accounts of purposely poisoning prisoners with smallpox appears to be yet another ghastly example of how Confederate authorities inhumanely punished Union soldiers. During Wirtz's trial, the government asked Joseph Jones, a Southern doctor, to testify about the conditions in Andersonville. Jones explained that the Confederacy did not purposely poison Union troops. He argued that the horrific conditions within the camp compromised the vaccination and inoculation process. They use these terms interchangeably. And that's what caused many Union prisoners to have their arms amputated or caused them to die as a result of infection. In an effort to support his claims, he drew on surviving evidence of physicians stationed throughout the Reconstruction South who had also witnessed abnormal reactions to smallpox vaccinations. As Jones interviewed Southern doctors, they often reported, rather nonchalantly, how they turned to enslaved infants and children in order to grow vaccinia. Wirtz's trial unintentionally left a transcript of a seemingly widespread, undocumented antebellum practice of using infants to harvest vaccine matter. Based on my calculations, the Civil War led to the largest inoculation campaign in the history of the United States. Both the United States and the Confederacy began a massive campaign to vaccinate troops. This practice, while providing protection against smallpox, also provided doctors with insight about how inoculation worked. It taught them about science. In an era before many doctors were formally educated in universities and teaching hospitals, they learned about medicine on the ground through trial and error with patients. The massive campaign to vaccinate produced an unprecedented number of case studies that allowed doctors to better observe what they referred to as spurious, which is the 19th century term for accidental vaccinations, problematic outcomes that resulted from failures in procedure or the existence of infectious disease or even gangrene. Jones' efforts to collect information from Confederate doctors throughout the South reflects the larger arguments in my forthcoming book, The Laboring Dead, From Subjugation to Science. I argue that during the 19th century, doctors throughout the world relied on physicians working with large groups of subjugated populations to develop theories about disease causation. I look at three major phenomena: slavery and emancipation, imperialism and colonialism, the Civil War, and the Crimean War. While each of these phenomena have their own separate histories and historiographies, they all produced large populations of captive people whose sickness and suffering led to the development of epidemiology. Within the history of medicine, scholars have examined how doctors use Black people for medical experimentation. Think of Deirdre Cooper Owen's work. They have also examined how the intersection of race and medicine led to new ideas of Black inferiority. Think of Rana Hogarth's work. They've even done a bit of both. I'm interested in looking at the collective body, not the individual body. I argue that slavery, imperialism, and war led to the unprecedented organization of large numbers of people in crowded spaces, which led to new theories about sanitation and later epidemiology. While scholars typically argue that sanitation reform began with the rise of urbanization and industrialization, I argue how slavery and war provided similar sites that led to crusades for sanitary reform. While the Civil War or Crimean War were not the first forms of military engagement that crowded troops or prisoners in confined locations, they did unfold at a time when doctors began to use these events as evidence to prove their theories. The Civil War and Reconstruction, in turn, must not just be seen as an isolated phenomenon relegated to the United States, but placed within a broader global context. In this framework, the case of using infants and enslaved children is not an aberration, but part of a larger pattern of using dispossessed populations of children in order to carry vaccine overseas. A French physician, for example, wanted to transport vaccine from China to Vietnam in the early 19th century, but carrying vaccine matter on glass or on cloth risked deterioration. So the French doctor turned to children as the carriers. He was not alone. A surgeon who worked under King Carlos IV of Spain brought 22 male orphans aboard a ship headed to Mexico and infected them with smallpox in order for their young bodies to produce vaccinia. When they arrived in Mexico, authorities had used up all the vaccine. So the physicians then turned to orphans in Mexico, who they infected with smallpox, and then trafficked them to Acapulco. The Mexican orphans were then sent from Acapulco to the Philippines and then to China. And there were other cases throughout Italy and Europe. As I argue in my book, the practice of using subjugated children to produce vaccinia is likely one of the most underreported stories in 19th century global history. Meanwhile, in the Reconstruction South, Jones found it difficult to collect evidence about accidents of smallpox vaccination since the Confederate archives were destroyed with the Union takeover of Richmond. Some of Jones' records survived and offered insight about his work. He wrote to Confederate doctors throughout the post-war South and asked them to send him copies of their surviving reports. Drawing on cases provided by these doctors, Jones adamantly argued that doctors at Andersonville incorrectly administered vaccination, which caused amputation to fail. In order to prove that the failure of procedure could lead to death, he cited examples from Russia in 1811 and Southwest Germany in 1818 to prove the efficacy of this scientific principle. The federal government remained unconvinced and believed that Wirtz purposely poisoned Union soldiers. For Jones, the war offered evidence to prove how accidental and improper vaccination led to this mortality. Based on the information that Confederate doctors throughout the South provided, Jones argued that the prisoners were not poisoned, but had a violent reaction to inoculation based on scurvy and crowded conditions of the camp. He explained that Union prisoners developed gangrene from the slightest abrasions of their skin, from insect bites to splinters. The lancets used to prick their skin to perform the vaccination injured them in the same way. He and other doctors had the chance to treat many patients and believed that this was the cause of their both amputations and death. Despite Jones' compelling efforts to explain the science that underpinned accidental vaccination, the judge advocate who administered Wirtz's trial adamantly disagreed. He further argued that Jones and other physicians knew that vaccination would lead to death. The judge advocate spoke on behalf of the dead prisoners, but no one spoke on behalf of the infants and the black children whose bodies were used to cultivate smallpox vaccine. There was no trial for them. There was no witness or rebuttals or charges leveled against those who engaged in this practice. There was not an investigation that explored the effects of these procedures on their bodies. What happened to their unburied bodies? Can critical fabulation serve as the narrative to tell their history? Can the title of Jessamine Ward's eloquent story, Sing, Unburied Sing, serve as the metaphor of emancipation, which Reconstruction has named freedom? Can freedom hold the dead, but forget the living to remember the past? Thank you.
There we go. As you'll notice, the title is slightly wholly different than what appears in the program, which is due to only my chronic indecision about what the title of any paper should be. Thanks again. As everyone else has said, I would like to also thank Manisha for organizing this wonderful conference and for asking me to be a part of it, and for all of you to be here with us on this nice spring afternoon. So we'll get started. There we go. What did it feel like to be free? This was one of a long list of questions field workers for the Federal Writers Project asked elderly former slaves like Annie Little. In total, the mostly white field workers interviewed over 2,000 formerly enslaved people living in the United States in the mid-1930s. Many of these people lived in the Deep South, near the places of their birth on slave plantations. Some were even interviewed by the descendants of the people who once owned them. Others had moved far away to places like Indiana and Ohio, or even as far west as Colorado, Wyoming, and Oregon. As many as 500,000 formerly enslaved people may have been living at the time, so the several thousand ex-slaves interviewed for Black poet and critic Sterling Brown's Negro Studies Project, the subdivision within the Writers Project that was responsible for collecting these interviews, they were only a tiny fraction of the population of ex-slaves still living in the 1930s, the people who had experienced slavery and emancipation firsthand. Now, despite the well-worn criticisms of their representativeness, the interviewees' responses to that question, what did it feel like to be free, open up a window onto the complex emotional worlds of freedom and freed people. Close readings of these interviews reveal patterns of experience and memory that expand our understanding of Reconstruction as primarily a political transformation that attempted to alter the legal status of freed people by making them into full citizens who possess the same political and civil rights as white Americans. That's one way to tell the story of Reconstruction. But these interviews bring to light other ways of telling the story of Reconstruction, stories that are at once smaller and more intimate, and yet at the same time far more expansive and profound than we might have imagined. So what did it feel like to be free? This question elicited a myriad of responses from ex-slaves. Some people spoke about the immediate joy at learning that slavery was over and recalled spontaneous celebrations of singing, dancing, and eating. This is the Jubilee narrative that most of us are familiar with. Even in 1938, Mose Davis could still picture his father running into their cabin, Mose said, swinging his arms like a windmill, shouting, "Boy, we is free. You can go and get yourself a job, because I ain't hitching up no more wagons." Jeff Bailey had been in town with his father when he first heard the news. "They said, 'You is free, your children is free,'" he recalled. Now, he never said who they were. Perhaps they were soldiers. And he said he was only, in his words, a little bitty old boy at the time. And the information really didn't mean much to him in the moment. It was only after he and his father arrived back home at the plantation that it became clear to him what was going on. It was at this time that his mistress confirmed to him the news. "You's free," she told him. "Go on out in the orchard and get yourself some peaches." And to Jeff, this was a monumental event because the farm had a beautiful peach orchard, but none of the enslaved people were ever allowed to eat the fruit from the trees. And so here was his mistress telling him, "You're free. Go and get yourself some peaches." They had a yard full of peaches, Bailey said. "Baby, did I get me some peaches." Now, while Jeff Bailey ate his peaches, others confronted the painful reality that it was dangerous to express joy over the coming of freedom. "You better hush, or you'll get a whipping." This was what Mary Jane Hartridge's mother told her when she reported that a soldier had just told her that she was free. Slave owners sometimes responded violently to this encroachment on their authority once the soldiers were gone. A soldier had told Eliza Evans not to let her master call her the N-word anymore. Instead, the soldier told her she should insist that he refer to her as Miss, an act of insolence so astounding that not only did her master whip her with a switch, but her own grandmother did too when she found out what the girl had done. But sometimes you didn't have to say anything at all. Harriet Robinson's mere presence so enraged her mistress that the woman beat her regularly every morning. She told Robinson, "Your master's out fighting and losing blood trying to save you from them Yankees, so you can get yours here," as she took the girl by the ears and slammed her head against the wall. If white people could freely express their anger, even rage, free people could not even after the war was over. Freed people may have gained the right to participate in electoral politics during Reconstruction, but they did not gain the right to their own anger. From the Emancipation Proclamation, in which President Lincoln admonished them to refrain from acts of violence, to the advice given out to them by Freedmen's Bureau agents who advised them not to talk back to whites who might abuse them verbally, freed people were just told to get over it. Take the case of Amos Spruill. He was a freedman in Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, it rarely snows in Wilmington, but in early January 1867, the white stuff covered the ground. The local Freedmen's Bureau agent here observed what he called a party of boys and men enjoying what he called the diversion of attacking everyone who passed, white and black, with snowballs. Based upon testimony from many witnesses that day, the agent felt that the group was just having some fun, right? And this is the beginning of the report that he writes up about what happens to Amos Spruill. So he said, "None thought of resenting this harmless character or the harmless character of the sport," began the agent in his report, but then he thinks better of his word choice. And he strikes out the word sport and replaces it with the word diversion. Perhaps he thought sport might suggest some degree of roughness on the part of the white snowball throwers. "None thought of resenting the harmless character of the diversion which was exercised upon all those who passed the place," he said. "That is until Spruill happened by and was hit by a snowball. He protested, and the gang began chasing him down the street, pelting him with snowballs as he ran. When they caught up to him, several of the whites began kicking and punching him. One of the group then drew out a pistol and threatened to shoot him. None thought of resenting the harmless character of the diversion, which was exercised upon all who passed the place, and that the freedman, Amos Spruill, took offense and resented in abusive language, which the defendants also resented by an unjustifiable assault, the agent's report concluded. The agent placed most of the blame on Spruill for taking offense at what the agent perceived to be as a harmless bit of fun. Although the snowball throwers may have overreacted by assaulting Spruill, the agent believed that if the freedman had just kept his emotions in check and his mouth shut, all the trouble could have been avoided. This iconic image of the Freedmen's Bureau argues that democratic self-governance is a deliberative, rational exercise that requires the suppression of emotion. Excessive emotion, particularly anger, is a danger to democracy, and that's certainly true. But this Enlightenment view of democracy obfuscates the extent to which emotion is both a tool of democratic politics and an end itself of those politics. The Declaration of Independence says as much when it proclaims human beings have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights affirm the founders' view that, in addition to life and liberty, human beings required some degree of emotional satisfaction in those possessions. More than simply provide safeguards against individual or collective encroachments on one's life and liberty, the government, in this view, must work to provide the conditions in which its citizens can pursue their own happiness, so long as that happiness itself is not a violation of the law or someone else's inalienable rights. The Declaration does not define what happiness is or tell us how to pursue it, but it puts emotional well-being at the center of the American experiment of democratic self-governance. Anger, psychologists tell us, is an important part of a normal person's emotional well-being. But historically, Black people in America have not been able to own their own anger or to express it or channel it publicly without risking violence from whites who, either individually or collectively, take action to suppress it. Amos Spruill's experience might lead us to ask, what are the long-term effects of this kind of emotional strangulation, where one racial group is allowed a wide range of emotional experience and expression, including anger or even rage, and another group is not? How does that shape not only social customs, but also public policy? It should come as no surprise, then, that many elderly ex-slaves who were interviewed by the Writers' Project recall feeling discombobulated, confused, restless, and dissatisfied when their long-awaited deliverance finally came. Not only did they have to moderate their emotional reactions to conform to whites' often sullen expectations about how they should feel and behave, they also had to perform some pretty deep soul-searching in order to determine what their pursuit of happiness might entail. Mary Lindsay was owned by a woman who refugeed her to Texas during the war. Afterwards, Mary continued to work for her in exchange for room and board. One day, a young freed boy came by and told Mary that he's going to work for a family in nearby Bonham, which is about 10 miles away, and he's going to be paid $1 a week. He tells her that many other local freed people from neighboring plantations and farms are also going there to work, and he tells her that she should go too. But Mary can't seem to muster the gumption she needs to follow him. She continues to work for her mistress, but she can't stop thinking about Bonham. Each day, when her work is done, she says she walked to the end of the property and would look out toward the town, imagining that she was there or some other place, dreaming about the possibilities that might await her. Finally, she decides to go. She throws her few clothes in a bundle and walks the 10 miles to Bonham under cover of darkness, fearful of alerting her mistress, the woman who's no longer her mistress, but just her employer. "I keeps on being afraid," Mary told the interviewer, "'cause I can't get it out of my mind that I still belong to her." Other interviewees recalled similar feelings. Robert Glenn, who was enslaved just a few miles from where I grew up, recalled feeling obligated to his former master, a man who had raised him since he was a very small boy and who had, all things considered, been pretty kind to him. He had taught Robert to read, and Robert pretty much ran the man's small farm in central Kentucky. There were no other enslaved people on the place. So when freedom came, Robert explained to his interviewer that he didn't feel right just up and leaving the man. People he knew had encouraged him to go to Nashville or Louisville, big towns where he could make some real money. He also thought about going back to North Carolina to try to find his mother, but he just couldn't settle his mind on what to do. So he spent his days wandering the woods, hunting and fishing, but mainly just walking and thinking. And at night, he would lie awake and think some more. After I retired at night, Glenn said, I made plan after plan and built air castles as to what I would do. Mary Lindsay and Robert Glenn's narratives invoke freedom as an act of radical imagination. They testify not only to the difficulty some free people had in wrapping their minds around their new status, but also the extent to which freedom required time and space for sorting out feelings. Emancipation was an emotional process as much as a political or a legal one. For the men and women who were a part of the charter generation of freedom, a term I use to describe the people interviewed by the Writers Project, people born in slavery but who came of age during the Civil War and Reconstruction, those emotional transformations took decades, even whole lifetimes. For some of them, in fact, giving their testimony to the Writers Project, a compromised historical project to be sure, nonetheless may have been the culminating act in their lifelong efforts to feel free.
All right, last paper before the keynote. Stay with me, please. I'll try to keep you awake. Thank you again to Manisha. I'm really honored to be with all of you and to see the faces of people whose books I really relied on a lot, including members of the panel. I'm gonna today turn our attention, or really pick up where Abby started us, with thinking about the material lives of freedom-seeking people. And it's a subject I take up in my book, Embattled Freedom, which joins our panelists, as well as Thavolia Glimpf, Chandra Manning, and others, in examining the experiences of men, women, and children who fled slavery during the war and began trying to build new lives for themselves inside the Civil War's slave refugee or so-called contraband camps. And in the book, I look at the things that they possessed, the spaces they inhabited, the food they ate, the clothing they wore, all in the effort to try and understand simply how they survived or tried to survive, which is a very fundamental part of the history of wartime emancipation. So today I thought I'd share one piece of that work by looking at something pretty essential to a person migrating through a war zone, and that's shelter, houses, and what was for some people a continual search for a roof over their head and a floor beneath their feet, a place to live, over the course of the Civil War and really well into the post-war and Reconstruction period. It's a pretty fundamental part of the story of really any migrating people over time and space. They move distances long and far, but they move in order to find a place to stop moving, to find a place to sleep, to eat, to pray, to begin building a new life, and especially to feel safe and protected. Migration has a certain momentum, but it also has its own built-in source of friction, the fundamental human need for shelter, for a place to live. And I began thinking about this in the course of this research when I saw photographs, ones that I'm sure many of you have seen as well, of newly erected cabins in places like Hilton Head Island, Camp Nelson, Kentucky, Helena, Arkansas, and others. And also after reading accounts from missionaries and Army officials who remarked on the rapid proliferation of new dwellings on the wartime landscape. For example, on a property that was known as the Taylor Farm outside Norfolk, Virginia, where 11 people were enslaved in 1860. By 1864, there were 200 houses there housing 1,000 people. Or on a plantation in Giles County, Tennessee, where 63 people had been enslaved on the eve of the war, now by 1864, there were 1,400 people living in 240 newly built structures, all of them erected by these refugees themselves with materials they either foraged or obtained from the army. On the one hand, each house marked an individual's or a family's movement toward freedom in a very visible and tangible way. And I think that's a pretty remarkable thing when you think about migration to freedom before the war, in which sheltering or concealing one's shelter was the rule. Now we see something becoming very visible. Yet collectively, the dwellings also draw our attention to the larger cultural landscape of emancipation itself, to borrow a concept well explored by geographers. If, as those scholars say, a cultural landscape is, quote, a cultural autobiography that humans have carved into the surface of the earth, or more succinctly, discourse materialized, then we have a lot to learn by reading these places as we would a text, where we can look at the architecture of individual shelters, at the arrangement of those structures in relation to one another, at the way humans sorted themselves out among them, and at the way the natural world impinged on it all, and see far deeper social and cultural meaning. I always remember Rhys Isaac's observation way back when, that the marks, as he put it, a society leaves on the terrain are meaningful signs not to be overlooked by historians. And I think this is especially urgent when studying newly freed people who left plenty of marks on the earth that can be read for insights, especially when textual archives might leave us wanting. And here I have to pay tribute to Stephanie Camp and her book, Closer to Freedom, which is really an inspiration and has been for my research. She certainly showed us what can be gained from an analysis of plantation space and the material culture of slave cabins. And Megan Kate Nelson's work, Ruined Nation, study of wartime landscapes, is also important in showing us that physical spaces were just much more than a backdrop to the past. Now, the spaces I'm talking about here did not just appear on the land uncontested during the war. The war's refugee camps drew together people across race, gender, and generational lines, coexisting in confined spaces, making it no small thing to figure out how all these people should coexist and co-reside in space. In spatial proximity, there's social proximity. And as formerly enslaved people, military officials, missionaries, and politicians alike contemplated the revolutionary new order of freedom, these dwellings in these settlements provided one of the focal points, channeling abstract ideas and values about race and freedom into concrete material forms. And I'll just highlight a couple ways in which this becomes very contested. And one, first, revolves around the question of how close refugees should reside to one another. White observers, particularly missionaries, had plenty to say, often with some disdain, about the living spaces of formerly enslaved people, reporting back north about dwellings built in the ruins of burned-out buildings, on top of levees in the Mississippi River, or inside caves dug into the side of a hill. They talked about the bamboo used to build floors and the way existing structures, like the stalls of a barn or an old slave jail, were transformed into living spaces. But they fixated on nothing more than the crowding inside these spaces, the way that 2 to 3 or 4 to 5, as they counted them, families, might squeeze into a one-room dwelling. To the missionaries and to white military officials, this was unhealthy jumbling or huddling, those are the words they often used. At odds, they said, with both emerging public health standards, as well as expectations that virtuous citizens should live in small nuclear families in distinct dwellings. And for some, large numbers of people in small spaces also stoked paranoia about insurrection. So when white authorities had the opportunity to plan the space of a camp and make it a little bit more permanent, which happened over time in regions that were more distant from active combat, they made sure its design would structure a particular form of domesticity. Each family should be put by itself as far as possible in one hut, and the huts kept distinct and separate from each other, was how a white chaplain in the Mississippi Valley explained it. For, quote, the privacy of the family should be established as far as possible in all contraband camps. So suggesting that space should be manipulated here to encourage a particular family structure, just like the Army was relying on marriage ceremonies and other policies that Tara Hunter describes in Bound in Wedlock. But formerly enslaved people instead brought with them another sense of space, one that did not necessarily associate living in nuclear families with freedom or crowding with degeneracy. "Don't care if we are crowded," is what one woman told a visiting teacher in Norfolk, a city where 9,000 people had migrated by 1864, often bypassing these planned settlements of small houses in favor of burned-out buildings in the city. The congregation of large numbers of people in smaller spaces could mean something different to these refugees. It could signify the reunion of an extended family or community had taken place and they didn't want to separate themselves again. Or it could increase the likelihood of encountering somebody who knew something about the whereabouts of lost kin. One woman in Portsmouth, Virginia, for example, refused to move into one of these planned settlements in order to stay in the city, where food was scarce but information could travel, because she was, in the words of a missionary, she had the hope of hearing something from her stolen ones. Sometimes, again, congregation could simply offer the promise of bodily protection. There was safety in numbers. So a crowded space could be a free space for a refugee from slavery, but I emphasize could, because it's not always true. Not all crowding is the same, as Jim has shown us in his work. Now, this is not to say that the privacy called for by that Mississippi Valley chaplain did not matter to formerly enslaved people settling into the camps. It did matter, and it might explain another conflict that emerged in Eastern Virginia over windows. When residents there resisted, and that's the word that the missionaries used, resisted putting glass windows into their houses, quote, contending that the door and chimney admit light and air enough, a group of Philadelphia Quakers immediately arranged to have hundreds of sashes sent into the wartime South and into that region. They need windows, the Quakers said. Well, surrounded by new faces, new surroundings, new officials watching their every move, not to mention the enemy ever present in the distance, it's not hard to imagine that these individuals resisted windows because they valued their privacy and wanted to limit how easily others could see the goings-on in their lives. It could be protective. Another issue, this is the last one I'll talk about, is another one of proximity, and that was the question of how closely black women and white soldiers should reside to one another. The terrifying reality of sexual assault may have led to court-martial trials, as Crystal Feemster has written about, but it also led military officials to search for a spatial fix by putting distance between the living spaces of these two groups. Physical proximity between white men and black women had made rape possible, even inevitable, some white officials believed, for it too easily allowed men, quote, promiscuous admission into refugee residences. Military and missionary reports of rape routinely emphasized that white men were intruders, violating both the bodies and the domestic spaces in which the women resided. The same spaces celebrated by white officials as essential for nurturing the private family values associated with freedom. But how far was an adequate distance? Some said, how about a mile? Some said 2 miles. Still others looked to islands, like those in the Mississippi River, as an ideal place to resettle the refugee population, particularly the women, since its natural water barriers could act as social barriers, isolating and protecting those living there. And indeed, 28,000 people were resettled on Mississippi River islands by 1864. Military officials boasted of what they believed was a great success on these islands. Island 64 near Helena, Arkansas was dubbed, quote, the gem of the Mississippi by the fall of 1864, because on it, over 1,000 residents had begun chopping the island's cottonwood trees to sell wood to commercial and military steamboats. They had become self-supporting, in the words of military officials. They had built their own houses. But what is known as this gem of a settlement was also located on an island that was uninhabited before the war for good reason. Excuse me. And not surprisingly, 18 months into its existence, the camp on Island 63 fell victim to flooding and was, quote, completely underwater. It was gone, and the residents all displaced. A story that reminds us that emancipation itself was, after all, a process of displacement for many people, often repeatedly. And the displacement did not just involve the movement of people, but the abandonment and destruction of their material lives over and over again. Just as housing went up, it also came down quickly throughout the entire war, not only because of floods, but also because of the upheaval of battles, and especially guerrilla violence. And that's kind of the flip side of the visibility of this housing. They also became targets, especially in the Mississippi River Valley, of Confederate guerrillas. And so all of this set the refugees in motion again over and over. And this did not stop when the war ended in 1865, but you could say it arguably worsened, because the lands on which most of these new settlements had arisen was precisely the same confiscated and abandoned lands that the Union began to debate how to manage. Of course, you all know what the question, the debate was: should it be returned to Confederate owners or carved up and made available to formerly enslaved people? Well, we know how that debate was resolved. We often talk about it as a failure of land reform or the failure of land redistribution. Language itself is pretty anodyne, pretty policy wonkish, marking the failure of an idea, a policy, a promise. But it was more than that. If we stop and envision what had been built on those lands over the course of the war, the marks that freedom-seeking people had left on the earth, then the story becomes even more devastating. I write in my book about the residents of what was known as Sinclair Farm in eastern Virginia. There were over 4,500 men, women, and children who settled there during the war and on an adjoining farm. Our settlement on Sinclair's farm is laid out in streets with order and regularity, the residents noted in the fall of 1865. They built 5 churches, a store of our own, as they put it. And the settlement contains many buildings of comfort and convenience, and even some of elegance. They had planted crops, too. They mobilized to save it. They wrote petitions. They hired an attorney. They held public meetings. But like most every other settlement like it, not all, but most, they lost everything. The reversion of the land to the former Confederate owners marked a tangible material loss of houses and gardens and schools and churches constructed by tens of thousands of freedom-seeking people, a loss of the infrastructure of their new lives. And I think that loss is only comprehensible, and I'll just conclude here, if we keep the landscape and the material lives of freedom-seeking people more clearly in view. And I think this vantage point also then forces us to consider that the basic effort to survive, even to have a shelter over one's head, would remain a vital and ongoing part of an ex-slave's pursuit of freedom well into the post-war period. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. There is time, about 15 minutes or so before the end of the session, so we have some time for questions. Doug Edgerton. So the question is about Camp Nelson and its location and what it was, and
Thank you. Yes, so because Kentucky stays in the Union to preserve slavery, the Confiscation Acts are not in force. So it takes a long time to negotiate with Kentucky to enlist soldiers. So it's 1864, spring of 1864, they start enlisting soldiers, and they are Kentuckians. They try to train them quickly and then move them off. Camp Nelson is a supply depot, so it's like right in the middle on this cliff, but it is known as a refugee camp because they come in with their wives, especially because they're subjected to violence if they leave. So, but then there's this kind of back and forth of expelling, saying they can't come in, okay, you can come in. So it's all this negotiation between 1864 and 1865, and after that expulsion, they do open up a quarters, but even the quarters that they open up for women and children, what I showed is from these huts that were these squatters of women and children who were not soldiers' wives, and so they were congregating there, and they were not, but this is not people bringing soldiers from South Carolina coming up to the Camp Nelson. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? Camp Nelson was just named a national monument about a month ago, I think. So National Park Service is now coming in, and it's already a great place to visit, but it's going to be definitely one in the future.
Are there further questions, please? Yes, sir. Could you identify yourself and, yeah.
No, I try to, thanks for your question. I try not to think about myself that much in it, but I would say two things. I would say first, one of the things for all of us to do is to really read Saidiya Hartman's work, because one of the things that Hartman is trying to say is she's trying to get historians to think about their relationship to their subject and to think about the narratives that we create in that process. So I sort of I frame it in that way, and then I'm sort of thinking really about what this was like for those children and for those families and for those people. That to me is the most important piece. And so then I try to make it in a way that captures your attention and you just don't slide by it in the record. I think there's ways that you can read some of this stuff and you can just see it in the record and kind of glance over it. But I sort of piece together, the whole process of vaccination, inoculation, that's coming from 19th century sources and so forth. But there's just these ellipses about how they use children and how they use sort of infants. And so that's why I sort of constructed that narrative in the beginning about what would have been for these people and how did they understand it.
Could I just ask you something more about that? Because I think it speaks to the question of the process. At what point in your work did you realize what was going on there?
Years later. I've been collecting stuff for this project since 2011, so I didn't really know what I was, to be frank with you, I was collecting for so long I didn't know. And then it wasn't until I got to, so I had Jones's document, and as an isolated document, I thought, okay, so here are these examples of using infants and using healthy children. And then it's like about a 200-page document. Then researching that and reading that more, and he's not a great writer. He's dense and he's circular. So anyway, then I realized, this is in response to words. So then I had to read all of this stuff on words. And then the point is, the stories kind of braid it, because there's a way in telling the story that it could just be about Jones at the Wirtz trial, but I'm reading against the plot of the Wirtz trial. And I'm in an effort to read, so it's all, my work is informed mostly by Black feminist theory. So it's like, if you read against the plot of the document, then you can sort of recenter another kind of subjectivity. So in the story, it's on one hand, I'm braiding through the story of the infant, but on the other hand, I'm braiding through the empirical evidence of the trial. And that's what I'm doing mostly throughout the history of trying to write about epidemiology in places like India in the 1870s or 1880s, or Cape Verde or Sierra Leone. You're just getting quick snapshots of these people. And I'm not so as a Reconstruction historian, you can be like, oh, Downs, you're the first one to do this. I'm not the first one to do this. Hartman talks about it in Venus in Two Acts. There's a whole literature that came up in the 1980s and 1990s by Hazel Carby, Reconstructing Womanhood, and all of that sort of teaches us how we could use these sources and how we can sort of tell these narratives. So that work of recovery has been enormously and profoundly influential in trying to construct these narratives for me.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, did you only use archaeological sites? Did you also refer to evidence about African sites and practices?
So thank you for the question. So the answer is yes. This is very much kind of Black Atlantic. So I had a manuscript workshop with Vince Brown, who basically gave me a bunch of reading, and I was like, okay, well, I'll devour this over the next year. And then we were looking at how you can not get ensconced in the Herskovits-Fraser debate of continuities, because really what I'm trying to say is not necessarily about, here, let's try to trace out the continuity, but instead let's see what's the imaginary, what's the function, what can we say is going on here that is not meant to be part of a white integrationist project. And a lot of it is a reimagined Africa, as well as a kind of where you see clear continuities because you see them in the diaspora, but there's other times where you can see that the syncretism is unmistakable. And so when I even see these different superstitions that a lot of people point out to me, like, oh, this is a Native American influence and this is a European influence. It's not always easy to tease out what the origin was, but it's been a kind of here's how different people have created resistance, especially around revolutions. Like the Haitian Revolution, what were some of the pig sacrifices that Ada Ferrer talks about in her book that are alternative ways of reading sources that we think we know.
Manisha. You come up here and ask. So the question is about how you tell a narrative of emancipation from the point of view of the people who experienced it, when the evidence comes from when they are elderly. There is the facet that you discussed, Carol, of ambivalence in people's minds, and to what extent is that a function of the evidence and of the distance, and to what extent does this help you kind of work on against the sort of jubilee and freedom narrative that is the standard format for this kind of explanation?
No, to what extent is age, the fact that these people are recalling a time when they're young, might have to influence that. So in the larger project, I do work with age quite a bit more than I did here. I sort of mentioned that Jeff Bailey, describes himself as a little bitty boy, and he's initially confused, right? And a lot of these narratives, they're quite complex in that they're understanding that they're telling a story about their own transformation. So they're telling a story, and they're recognizing that I'm telling a story about something that happened when I was young, and I was confused at that time. I didn't quite understand what was going on, right? There's a lot of uproar. Soldiers are arriving. We don't know what's going on. They're making mistakes about what to do. They're getting, punished for it. But at the time that they're telling this story in the 1930s, they're telling a story about how they came to realize what was going on, right, and what that process was like. And a lot of times it is tinged with confusion, again, because I think they are young. A lot of the people are quite young. Jeff Bailey was young. Robert Glenn is a different story. He's already an adult. He's 18 or 19 years old by the time that the war is over, and he's sort of going through this process. So it varies. But when the narrators are narrating in the 1930s, when they're very old, they're sort of telling this process of transformation. This is the process of how I came to understand what was happening to me, and how I came to feel the kind of joy that I witnessed in a lot of other people, and how I came to sort of own that feeling and come to think of myself as free. And for some of the people, it was still, I think, an ongoing process. So age definitely plays a role in the way that they're constructing their narratives over the course of their lives. But I also think that there is a kind of essential ambivalence about not freedom itself. I don't think anyone is ambivalent about being free and about the fact that slavery is over. They're ambivalent about how it's coming about, right? And the fact that it's coming on the winds of war, that it's being brought to them in many cases on the barrel of a gun. And there are lots of narratives that talk about, these soldiers that are arriving on plantations are not nice people, right? And they're not particularly kind to enslaved people. And the way in which it's sort of, they're understanding it as a protracted, contested process that is not sort of, there's not a clear break with the past, and that is in itself something they're coming to terms with. They recognize, that that things have changed, but trying to come to terms with exactly how much things have changed and how much, change is going to affect their life and what the impact of that is going to be. There's one narrative that I sort of didn't have in this because of the time constraints, but this one woman says, after the soldiers left and they told us we were free, she said everything got really quiet. And then it was really sad because we had to think about all the people who had gone, all the people that they had lost over the course of slavery, over the course of the war, and then try to figure out, right? And it's a really, I think it's such that sort of change in status and kind of come to terms with what is going to come next and what your role is going to be and how you're going to figure that out is a really profound sort of, existential issue that I think does entail a lot of ambivalence and a lot of sadness, at the same time, a lot of joy and a lot of hopefulness.
We have time for one more question. Well, I'll exercise the chair's privilege then. If I could just quickly ask Amy and Carol, it really connects these two questions about refugees and movement of people, but also emotions. You both mention the importance of gathering information, particularly about scattered family members or lost people or whatever. And we know from many other circumstances that this is a highly important thing in any human movement, particularly under duress or under hardship. Do you have a sense from the evidence that you've studied of how much that dominated or affected freed people's thinking and experience during the process of becoming free?
It's pretty central. And it's something that could use more study. I think Susan O'Donovan's working on it right now. But just some of the things that I observed, as far as the refugees go, there's a lot of sort of, I don't know if you want to call them secondary movements, but somebody going and sort of exploring and figuring out what's going on and then going back and carrying that information. That's a pretty dominant pattern I see. But then the other one is the importance of urban spaces as a place to try to pass the information on. But I think there's far more to be explored on this.
Right.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that I deal with in a larger project is about the hesitancy. A lot of people like Mary Lindsay had to leave where they had been enslaved. A lot of the people who were interviewed by the Writers Project are still very close to their sites that they were enslaved. And a lot of people talk about sort of, they know that they can leave and they're watching other people leave. And they're just not sure, right, about what's out there, right? You could, because they hear stories are also coming back, because people go and then they come back. So there's a lot of sort of circular and return movements in those first few months and years after emancipation. And they hear stories about people who go and it's a lot worse than where they left. So so there again, it's a lot to sort of take in and to try to decide, what's the best thing to do. Where are we going to be better off? A lot of times their hands are forced because plantations have been burned or things have been destroyed and there's not much to stick around for. There's always that sense of trying to sort of figure out what's out there, what's a danger to me, where is it going to be better, how do I figure that out?
I think your comment about trust and loyalty, and I mean, that sort of plays in here as well, would be an interesting study for somebody about how information's evaluated too, and who's trustworthy and not.
Yeah, there's one narrative I have where a woman, a young girl, is walking and a Union soldier stops and asks her, what are all those white flowers in the field? She's like, white flowers? What are you talking about? It's cotton. Right? And she actually sort of says, how can, I'm supposed to do what you tell me to, and you don't even know what that is, right? You don't have the kind of local sort of, you're so green and have absolutely no understanding of where you are.
Probably from Connecticut.
Yeah.
Could we thank our speakers for a fascinating session?